Hi, Ray Middleton here. In my role as Workforce Development Lead and PI Developer for Fulfilling Lives, and also in the Northeast of England for Changing Lives, a new role of developing reflective practice. I get to meet a lot of frontline staff, and part of the feedback for me has been that people aren't really sure what reflective practice is, and often not too sure why to do reflective practice, what's in it for them, how would it help them do their job. And so I'm trying to role model reflective practice because I think it's really a great way to develop skills and knowledge around complex needs and to get better in the work that we do. And so I've reflected on that feedback, and I thought maybe a short film explaining some of what reflective practice is would be really helpful. And so that's what this is, a short film to explain reflective practice. Also, to put it in context, reflective practice is one of the 6 key elements of PI, psychologically informed environment. So this is only just about reflective practice, but the other ones would be about concentrating on building quality relationships and skills that help you build quality relationships with clients and with staff, about having a psychological framework of some kind, about thinking about the social and physical space that we're delivering our services in and how safe they make people feel who've had a lot of trauma and neglect in their past. That's really important about creating a safe environment for people. Also about evaluating what we do to try and make a difference, see what difference we're making and try and have an honest look at how we could get better and evaluate the impact we're having. And the last element of PI is training and support for staff. And so this is just looking at one of those elements, which is reflective practice. So reflective practice is a way to develop our knowledge and skills around something by reflecting on our own practice and evaluating it in the light of something else. So that something else could be some theory about complex needs, or about what helps us get better, or about what good ways of working. Or the other light you could reflect upon is talking to colleagues or with other people and reflecting together about what was good about that experience and what could have been better. How could we learn to develop our skills? And in this way, it creates a circle of reflective learning, which we can apply all the time in the work that we do, which is to have an experience, and then not just to experience it, because just experiencing things doesn't necessarily build up our skills and knowledge, because we can learn a lot more and develop our skills by actually reflecting on that experience outside of the experience, and then reflecting in the light of what other people think. So you need to create a safe space where it's safe to kind of say what you thought went well about that experience, but also how you felt about it. Often people can feel anxious or a bit uncertain, a bit annoyed, sometimes other feelings. So you need a safe space where it's safe to reflect on what went well about it, but also what could have been better. And also in the light of a bit of theory, so I'll produce a few other films with some of the theory around working with complex needs, which you might find helpful to reflect upon. And then that creates a cycle where you then come to some conclusions in your reflection. You think, well, what will I do better? So come up with a plan. Think, well, having reflected, I think I'll do this better next time. I think I'll do this. And that way you're developing your skills and practice and knowledge. And you create a circle, and then you have another experience and you reflect with other people. You decide on how you could get better, and it creates a learning cycle which develops your skills. And that's really what reflective practice is. So I think it's important to say there isn't one correct way to do reflective practice. There's different models out there. I'll explain a few of them in a minute. But the important thing, and there's different ways to do it. So you could come together in a group of people to reflect on some experience and a bit of theory and learn together about what you're doing well and what you could do better. And that way create that loop. But also on a one-to-one, you can do it informally or in a formal kind of thing where you meet up on a one-to-one with someone maybe every couple of weeks. Or it could be informally over a cup of tea where you're saying, oh, this happened, I was a bit confused, I did this. And also you could do it writing learning journals. You could do it by writing, sometimes people blog and write online diaries. There's all sorts of ways you can do reflective practice either with yourself or with other people. It's more effective when you do it with other people usually. So a quick answer to the question of why bother doing reflective practice. People might think, well, I do my job well enough, I don't need to bother, I'm quite busy. But actually it's difficult work working with people with complex needs. And it has a lot of emotional wear and tear on us if we're doing it well, because we're forming relationships with people who find relationships difficult. There's evidence that people with complex needs have more than the average amount of trauma and neglect than the average person in their past, and they have less than the average amount of skills to deal with those difficulties in life. And so one of the experiences people with complex needs have is they struggle to reflect productively on their experiences, and so they repeat patterns which are unhelpful, maybe around using alcohol and drugs, or about falling out with people, or difficulties. So in order to build those skills, people with complex needs need the opportunity to reflect and think, I wonder why I've been evicted for the third or fourth time, or I wonder why this is happening again. Why is this pattern happening? And so if we're going to help people to reflect and learn, we need to be able to role model that ourselves and do that ourselves. Otherwise, how can we help someone to reflect and learn to do life more effectively if we're not willing to do that ourselves as staff? And so reflective practice also helps us as staff feel a lot better at the end of the day. Because instead of bottling up that emotional wear and tear about anxiety, frustration, maybe fears and anxieties, we can process them better because we reflect and think, oh, I felt anxious about this. I wasn't sure whether I did the right thing, or I felt annoyed at this decision, and I did this. And that uncertainty of the work, which is always part of doing good work with people with complex needs, can get resolved repeatedly through reflective practice, where you can reduce the anxiety by listening to other people's experience of trying to do this work, how it made them feel, and help each other. So we can create a trusting environment with others where we can learn, and that helps us to do the job more effectively. So a really important answer to the question, why bother with reflective practice, is that it's part of the antidote to the emotional wear and tear, the difficulty. And usually without reflective practice, staff and services get very reactive to each crisis, and they start to kind of fall out with other services, fall out with clients. And reflective practice allows you to press the pause button and think, I wonder what's going on here. Am I getting into a pattern here of reacting? And you can do more effective work if you get in the habit of reflecting and build better relationships with people then. So the next question is about what model to use. There are different models of reflective practice, and I'm pretty relaxed about this. I think there isn't a correct answer. There's just different models out there, and often a bit of a hybrid model is quite useful. So you need to work out what works for you. I'm going to suggest a couple, but it's dead simple. Don't overcomplicate it. It's the idea of some kind of model which allows you to work through the process of an experience and evaluating it, and then deciding what have you learned from that and what would you do differently as a result of your reflection, and that creates that circle. So there's different models out there. So one model of reflective practice is a guy called Terry Borton, wrote a book in the 1970s, and that's dead simple. He says there's 3 stages to the reflective practice process, and he says what, so what, and what next. And in a way, all that means is what happened. So you talk about the experience of what happened. Then you say, so what? That's kind of like, well, what can I learn from that? Analyze it, evaluate it, think, well, did I do this well, and what could I have done better, and did other people see it in a different way? And then the third bit of the cycle is what next, which means, well, if I was going to get better at my job, if I was going to get better at what would I do differently now that I've reflected? And that's really shows how simple reflective practice can be. Often people are doing this anyway, intuitively, but it's good to kind of get into a habit of doing it more structured and a consistent way, because all the evidence about working with complex needs is that people tend to do less and less and less reflection, more and more reaction, get burnt out, start being off with stress at work and stuff. And reflective practice is the antidote to this, where you can kind of just get in this habit of being able to process those feelings better. But that model shows how simple it can be. Another model comes from a guy called Schoen, and he makes a distinction between reflecting in action and reflecting on action. So often working with people with complex needs, you have to kind of think on your feet and do something, and you're in situations which are quite stressful, and you do something. So in the moment, you are reflecting to some extent, and you're making your best decision about what to do based on your experience and knowledge and a guess about what's going on. And that may or may not be a great decision, but nobody's perfect. We're all on a learning curve, really. So then the difference then he makes is to say reflecting on the action is different from in the middle of it all. So at another time, you can then describe what happened to a colleague or to someone else, or write a reflective journal, and you reflect on it and you think, oh, this is how you recall and you remember what happened. This happened, someone asked me about this, I felt anxious, I had a lot on my to-do list, and I said, oh, come back later, and then they stormed out. I'm just giving an illustration. And you might think, actually, on reflection, I'm thinking maybe I should have put the to-do list aside and listened to this person more, but I felt under pressure, and that's why I said, could you come back later? And so that shows you that's the distinction between reflecting in the moment and reflecting on the action later instead of in the action. And a lot of the learning comes from reflecting on the action rather than just doing stuff, because we can just keep reacting. So that's a good insight he had. The other key point he made was about you need to allow a bit of doubt about the action, the practice that you do. If we always trying to present a front that we're perfect at what we're doing, really good, and we couldn't really learn any more, and we're not going to reflect, then we can't really learn much. So you need to allow the fact that we're all a work in progress, we make mistakes, and we could get better at what we do. So you can create a safe space. That doubt allows us to develop our skills and knowledge. So that allows me to develop my skills and knowledge, for example, because I can, another way to put it in an open dialogue way, a guy called Bakhtin, is to accept that we only ever partly know what's going on. And so it's okay to kind of say, well, this is what happened, this is what I thought was going on, and this is what I did. I was a bit surprised at the action, I want to learn from this, and we'll reflect. But that way, you allow a little bit of uncertainty and doubt to say, well, maybe I could have done that better. And that allows you to develop and grow. But obviously, to do that, we need a bit of trust with others so they listen to us and we don't feel too harshly judged by others, but instead encouraged to kind of develop our skills. So in reflective practice, we've said that we can enhance that third section of evaluating our practice in the light of some theory or research or evidence. And staff on the front line, when you work with people with complex needs with some serious mental health problems combined with alcohol and drug problems, which tend to then get people into difficulties with homelessness or various stages of homelessness, sometimes problems with offending. On the frontline, staff often say to me they're not sure about what the research evidence is. It's not something that's often shared or reflected about. So what I'm going to do is very quickly in this film, just for about a minute each, I'm going to challenge myself to sort of only talk for 60 seconds on each of 10 top tips about what there is some theory or evidence for good practice around. And there's lots more stuff out there than these 10. These are just my ideas, reflecting on the work I've done over the years. But I'll make another film about each of these 10, so a bit of a longer film, it's a 10-minute film, so that you can kind of get into it in a bit more depth. But to give you some ideas about what we mean, I was thinking of splitting into 2 groups of 10. So 5 tips about understanding people with complex needs and what the evidence is around that, and then 5 tips about what are good skills that frontline staff can practice and what the evidence is for that. And that way we're reflecting on understanding the clients more, but also reflecting on ourselves and what we're like. And that's really important as well in terms of reflective practice and developing our skills. So, for example, when we look at people like Professor John Lisley, who's reviewed the research evidence around complex needs helpfully, what he found was that people with complex needs tend to have more than the average amount of trauma and neglect in their past than the average person, and less than the average amount of skills to deal with that trauma. And so in reaction to that, people tend to develop difficulties with alcohol and drugs, repetitive excess, self-harming, etc. And so I think that makes a lot of sense to me when I was fortunate enough to get some training from John Lisley a few years ago. And it's worth bearing that in mind. And so my first tip would be to say that the research suggests that group of people with complex needs tend to struggle with their identity. And that's the first tip. And by identity, it's things like finding a role in life. So that could be to do with a job, employment, a role in our families, like whether we're a mum, a dad, a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter, or uncle, or these kind of roles. But also it's about finding some direction in life. And people find that really difficult with complex needs, more than the average amount of person. And also our identity is to do with motivation. So people would struggle to be motivated, maybe to avoid disappointment. And so accepting that people lack motivation and then working on building their motivation is a really good approach. And so around identity as well, people really struggle with, on that first tip about reflecting about, there's some good evidence that people struggle with belonging to things. Like there's some really good stuff around attachment theory. There's loads of stuff, just Google it. But that kind of says that people struggle to join things and belong to things. And then also to do with people's identity is they struggle to leave things. So the endings of relationships with staff are quite painful, often difficult, and can be challenging because that's about endings. So dealing with loss and separation and leaving groups or relationships and forming relationships is difficult. So that's my first tip, is there's some good research evidence around people struggle more than the average amount with their identity and their direction and motivation in life. So my second suggestion are about understanding the clients more, and that idea about reflective practice. You think about what you did, talk about action you did, you evaluate and think what was good, what was not so good. And then the third bit we're thinking about topics about where there's some theory which could help our evaluation. So the second topic I'd say about understanding the client group is that more than the average amount of person, that people will struggle to manage their emotions. So that struggle to manage anxiety and fear, to struggle to manage feeling angry and annoyed, and so they might act out that anger quite a lot, and struggle with guilt and shame is very common, and struggle to enjoy life more than the average amount of person. So I'm a human being, and I used to have complex needs myself, so and managed to find ways to get better in the 1990s. But even though I've got better enough to work and hold down the job for 20 years, I still get anxious, and I still sometimes struggle to enjoy life, etc. So I'm saying these things are normal human experiences, but on the scale of things, it's at the more extreme than the average level of difficulty. So people would struggle to manage their emotions of getting depressed maybe, and struggling to enjoy life. So they're the kind of main things to think about there. That's the second point, is handling emotions. Quite difficult for this client group, so it's worth reflecting on that and maybe having a discussion about that. So the third tip I had about thinking about the client group would be to say that there's good research evidence that people struggle around relationships. So I tend to split this simply into forming relationships with other people, cooperating. So asking for help and accepting offers of help is quite difficult. And also dealing with conflict is another key area about relationship building skills. And more than the average amount of the average human being, people with complex needs struggle to how to deal with conflict when there's a difference of opinion with other people. So some people might be very conflict avoidant, other people might be conflict kind of attracted to, used to kind of getting involved in conflict. And people struggle to ask for help. There's some really good films we've made with our Experts by Experience group, looking at this issue, and they kind of draw out that trust is a really important issue. They're struggling to trust other people, to trust staff, and that's why it's difficult to ask for help and to cooperate with the help that's offered, because they need to get that confidence that staff and services are trustable and going to be reliable. So that's another key area where there's some good research evidence that people find asking for help and relationships difficult. And then I'd say the fifth area, or the fourth, can't quite remember how far I've got on my list, but is that there's good research evidence that people struggle with problem solving. So that's describing a problem realistically, so trying not to minimize the problem or exaggerate the size of the problem, but to size it up reasonably well, to come up with a plan to solve the problem, then to put the plan into action, and then to reflect productively on the plan. That's what I mean by problem solving. So there's good evidence that people with complex needs, because their kind of emotions are driving the system, they've had more than the average amount of trauma and neglect, less than the average amount of skills to deal with that. So there's lots of feelings there, there's lots of anxiety and anger and sometimes guilt and shame, and driving the system, which can be quite a chaotic lifestyle. And so they tend not to reflect productively on a problem-solving experience. And so if you can help people to reflect productively, then whether or not the problem is solved, you could think, well, what could I learn from that? What could I do better? So instead of planning, sometimes people are quite impulsive. They see the problem and then kind of do something quite dramatic, which can lead to more problems. So that's another area, fourth area, that's really worth reflecting on, is to what extent if you think about somebody you know and you're trying to help and reach out to, what are they like at problem solving? what are they like at doing relationships, of asking for help or dealing with conflict? What are they like in there? What's their identity? How would they describe themselves? What are their goals in life? Or do they struggle to articulate and name those goals, the direction, the journey they're going on in life? What's their motivation level like? Do we need to help people to build that motivation to change, rather than assuming it's there? And then the fifth area that's really important to reflect on is that with people with complex needs, their social context is really important. So often people are in inappropriate housing or difficult housing environments where they're with other people who can be re-traumatize them through difficult kind of interactions, harm. Or they might be in relationships. More than anyone can end up in these relationships, but more than the average person, people with complex needs might be in relationships that are unhelpful. Could be a domestic violence situation, not for everyone, but it's an example of how the context is really important. And people with complex needs, there is some good research evidence around they're more sensitive to their environment than the average person. So it's very important. So one thing to think about there is that if we're a member of staff who are working with someone with complex needs, we're part of their environment. So the more we can role model good skills about managing our own emotions well, about problem solving collaboratively with them, about being able to do relationships well and reasonably well and role model them. If we're fairly sure about our role and our identity in terms of what we're trying to offer, that can help the client then to learn those skills themselves. So they're the 5 tips about reflecting on where there is some evidence around people with complex needs. Those are the 5 areas that I'd suggest you could just take one of them and have a chat with someone and reflect and think, oh, I wonder about, relationships. I wonder about handling emotions with the clients that we're working with. I wonder about the environment they're in and if you could change that. So what I do now is think about 5 other topics about reflecting on ourselves as staff, and what are the kind of top 5 tips I'd have for skills where there's good research evidence that this does help. So there's lots more to life than these 5 things, but this is my kind of tips to say that there is some research and evidence around this, and so you could introduce that to your reflective practice cycle. So you said, I did this, or you describe how you felt and what you did, and then you evaluated it, and you said, in that reflective practice way, and we're saying, well, what was good about what I did and what was not so good? And then you get to that 3rd stage where we kind of introduce a bit of theory or evidence. That's what I'm going to do now, is suggest 5 topics which might help. You don't have to reflect on all 5 at one time, but you could reflect on one of them, and that might enhance the evaluation. And then the 4th bit is where you say, well, if I held in mind what I've learned by reflecting in this last 5 minutes over a cup of tea or last half hour, or then what would I do differently? How would I improve my skills when I'm working with people in the future? So my 5 suggestions is that being validating is really important. So as I said, I'll make some short films about each of these topics to kind of go into them in a bit more depth. But validating is about listening to what a client says, acknowledging how they feel and what they're thinking. Because often people have had very invalidating experiences in their past growing up, so it's really valuable to be with someone. You can acknowledge someone how they feel without having to agree exactly with them. You can still just say, well, I understand you feel really cross because you think this was unfair. So it's about just acknowledging that someone feels and thinks something. Summing up is an example of validation, so you could kind of regularly sum up and say, have I heard you right? You're feeling anxious about going into that group because you feel people will judge you, or you feel annoyed that you haven't got any money, and you feel frustrated, you feel it's that they're examples of summing up what someone said, and then they can correct you, or they can say, oh yeah, and they feel listened to and validated. So there's quite a bit to validation, but it's a kind of also acknowledging the good things people have done and praising people is another way to add to validation. And there's quite a bit more to it, but that's you could think about validation and think, well, how much am I validating in my practice towards the people I'm working with? So that's my first tip. The next thing is motivation. There's good evidence that building motivation helps. So people might have been on some training around motivational interviewing is really a good set of skills. You could look into that or Google it, or I'll do a little film about it as well to kind of go into a bit more depth about the skills around motivational interviewing. But there's more to it than that as well. You just anything that motivates people. So you could look at the pros and cons, for example, of some ways in which people are being in the world, and what's the advantages of changing, what's the disadvantages of changing. So that way you're weighing up, you're not assuming people are motivated to change, and you slow the whole process down, and that's really helpful. So and you can help people to, so encouraging people. It's important to communicate hope for people, because often people have reduced their motivation because of past disappointments. So it's important to be realistic, but to communicate hope that it's possible for people to change, and to be encouraging. Encouragement is an example of motivation. So that's the second idea. So be validating is my first example of where there's some research evidence that it's a good skill for staff to practice. The second thing is to build motivation at every opportunity. The third thing I'd say there's good evidence for is to work collaboratively. So this might sound very straightforward, but collaborative working often gets missed out, because when people are working with people who've got complex needs, often staff say they feel overwhelmed with anxiety or not sure what to do. And so they tend to rush into a plan which hasn't really been kind of co-produced or co-developed with the client that they're working with. And so it's important to slow the whole thing down. So often, when they research this stuff, often mistake well-meaning staff make is they come up with a really good plan, but they've assumed that the client's motivated or sees the problem in the same way that the staff member does. So you need to slow the whole process down, have a conversation about how they see the world and what they want to prioritize, and come up with a collaborative plan about changing for the better. And that might mean weighing up and spending a bit of time building up motivation to change, and then eventually working out a plan that someone's genuinely collaborating with and involved with, rather than coming up with a great plan that someone's kind of just ignores then, and then you're puzzled why the next week why the plan hasn't worked. So collaborative working, really important. So that's my third kind of tip, where there's good research. So you could reflect and think, well, I wonder how collaborative this was, or had I kind of assumed someone was more motivated, do I need to go back? So you can think about theories of change for that, which there's loads of them out there, but dead simple, you just think about working out, describing a problem and collaboratively kind of seeing how the client sees that problem, and then working out whether people are motivated to change, or are they feeling they don't need to change on that. And so you might build up motivation first, and then people get round to a stage of actually thinking, I do want to change on this. So you could come up with a collaborative plan where people genuinely engage with changing. They might look at alternative ways to deal with something, say problem solving instead of self-harming, or instead of going off to get drunk or taking drugs. When you feel like you've got lots of problems, think about problem solving as an alternative. There's lots of things you could do, and then you could reflect and think, how do I maintain this change? If I learn some skills to deal in a different way with life's difficulties, how do I keep that going and maintain it? Because usually people kind of do a bit of forwards and backwards. So that's a simple cycle of change. There's lots out there, but they kind of help us to not jump into a plan, but kind of work collaboratively. So then the last two suggestions I'd have is, say, the fourth area where there's good evidence for skills building from us, if we're reflecting on ourselves, is to build trust in the relationship with our clients. So our trustability. So there's lots of things that can help with that. You'll have a discussion, have a reflection, think, well, what helps build trust? Because if you think people have had more than the average amount of trauma and neglect, less than the average amount of skills, people tend to be very wary about other people and staff. And we might think we're a good member of staff, but actually the other person doesn't know that. They need some evidence from us. So things that help to build trust is be consistent. Yourself, be consistent, but also other members of the team give a consistent message and consistent offer, so you're not kind of giving mixed messages. And then as much as you can with other people, other services might be supporting someone, your same client, is try to have a consistent message and approach there, so you can be a container for them, kind of in terms of emotionally, psychologically for them, and be consistent, be reliable, try not to overpromise things, try to be realistic about what you can do. These are all things that build trust. And so what I'd say is the fifth topic, so you could reflect in that reflective practice there, you could think the bit of theory when you're evaluating what you did, you could think, well, how much is my practice building trust? How much is it, am I being reliable? Or are we being consistent as a team or with others, or are we not? And that's a good topic to reflect on. And I think my final, I've tried to do this all in about 10 minutes, before I got to 15 minutes with this, but I tried to rattle through 10 top tips for when you're working with people with complex needs, what are good topics to reflect upon? And I wouldn't try to reflect on all 10, but you could choose one of them and add it into that bit of describing your practice, evaluating what was good about it, what was challenging, bit of theory, and then, well, in the light, if I held in mind what I've reflected on, what would I do differently? So my 10th topic, or my 5th one in terms of thinking about ourselves as staff, as opposed to thinking about the clients and what their issues are, is maintain our role and limits. Or another word for limits is boundaries. So I've made another film about that, so you could look that up. But really, it's about trying not to overpromise. If this is our job, stick to our role and limits and maintain that. And we'll get pushed and pulled emotionally, wear and tear on the front line, to kind of get outside of our limits. And sometimes people feel anxious, so they start doing less than their job or more than their job. And so by reflecting with others, you can think, well, am I communicating well and sticking to what it says I do as a job? And there's a bit of flexibility in that, but what usually happens is people get worn out if they start doing too much, and they tend not to notice that, or else people get burnt out and anxious, and so they tend to do less and less of their job. And so by reflective practice, and think, well, what's our role and limits? Even in the staff team, if you're doing a similar job, you can hear what other people think their job is, and usually you get a bit surprised because you think, oh, I thought we did this, and someone else says, I think we did that. So that's a good topic to reflect on. So they're my 10 top tips for reflective practice in that model where you think, well, let's add a bit of theory and practice into our reflection. So I hope you found that helpful, and look up the other films, because we'll make some other films about each of those 10 areas, but go into a bit more depth. I've already made a film about the reflective role and limits, so you can look that one up, and as quick as we can, we'll make the other ones. So I hope you found this helpful. Thank you. If you found this talk about reflective practice helpful, do feel free to email the link to a friend or a colleague who might also find it helpful, and maybe watch the film with someone else and then talk to them about reflective practice. What do you think? And just try it out a bit. Just say, well, what do you think about, do we get some chance to do that informally? Would it be better to do a bit more formally? Just have a chat with someone and reflect on the extent to which in your work and service you already do reflective practice, and the extent to which you could get better at it as a staff and services, and what would help. Have a think about what would help you do more of that. So thank you.